Hello everyone, I'm Nina. Welcome to my new channel where I hope to explore historic, political, and other subjects of interest. The technical parameters will improve, as would me sounding still a little sick and quite stuffed up, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do and you gotta record when you have the time. So for my first episode, I'd like to discuss kind of a lesser known event, and that is the famous British authors Lewis Carroll's, the author of Alice in Wonderland, trip to Russia in 1867. So why did Lewis Carroll want to meet the members of the Russian Orthodox Church? And why was he mesmerized and probably a little bit terrified by the word защищающихся? The word is a declined form of those who protect or defend themselves. And he wrote it down by sound as follows. So, of course, the British author was a big fan of language games, nonsense words. We all know the poem Jabberwocky, which is included in Through the Looking Glass from 1871. And the first few lines read, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre in gimble in the wabe, all minsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe." English is my second language, even though I live in an English-speaking environment. So for me, it's very surreal to read these nonsense words, although they do follow standard English rules, and there are lots of exceptions in English, of course. So, in fact, some scholars suggest that there may have been a link between early 20th century Russian avant-garde, which also questioned language rules, language as such, semantics, and so forth, and Lewis Carroll. Others claim that Lewis Carroll's experience with society as distinct as he probably would have perceived 19th century Russia partly inspired him to write Through the Looking Glass. So what exactly was Lewis Carroll doing in Russia in 1867? Where did he go? What did he think? So first, Lewis Carroll traveled in his ecclesiastic role. He was a deacon of the Church of England, and he traveled with his friend, Reverend Henry Liddon, H.P. Liddon. It was the latter who proposed this voyage to Russia, and Liddon was a prominent British theologian, and for a time he was Dean Ireland's professor of the exegesis of Holy Scripture at Oxford University. So Liddon was interested in improving the relationship between the churches of the East and the West. As we know, the two churches had been split since 1054, so for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and this was a fairly popular subject of discussion at that time. So specifically, Liddon wanted to facilitate communication between the Church of England, which he represented, and the Russian Orthodox Church, and Lewis Carroll accompanied him on this quest. So what was Russia like at this time? Now, very generally speaking, for the purposes of brevity, this was a time of change. Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs, landed peasants attached to the land, farmers, low-ranking farmers, in 1861, which was a huge deal, but social and economic changes took much, much longer. And in fact, this major legislative political event coincided, roughly speaking, with the abolition of slavery in the United States around the same time. Now, Russia at this time was a largely agrarian farming country. However, of course, large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg displayed many of the signs of urbanization that were brought on by the Industrial Revolution, like in other places in Europe. So, for example, railway construction was on the rise. The two places that Dutton and Lewis Carroll visited, Nizhny Novgorod and Moscow, were in fact connected by a railway that was built in 1862. The period between the 1840s and 1860s was also a time of lively intellectual, cultural, spiritual debates between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. Now, the former strongly believed that Russia has its own path, and in part that path was defined around the Russian Orthodox Church. In contrast, the Westernizers wanted to emulate Europe, and we see the legacy of these debates into the 21st century, in fact. So these debates were also loosely linked to more radical political movements like anarchism and nihilism. So, for example, famous activist and scholar Mikhail Bakunin was active at this time. Cultural production thrived. For instance, a year prior to Carroll's visit to Russia, Fyodor Dostoevsky published his famous Crime and Punishment. In the late 1860s, Modest Mussorgsky wrote the first version of his well-known opera Boris Godunov, which was then revised. And Peredvizhniki, a group of traveling artists, sometimes they're called the Wanderers in the West, also arose around the same time with famous painters like Ilya Repin and Ivan Shishkin and many others, of course. So this was a very interesting time in Russian history of the late imperial period. Carrolls and H.P. Lytton's trip took place between July 12th and September 13th of 1867, so it was a pretty lengthy trip, about 2 months. The pair visited major cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, smaller ones when they went to Nizhny Novgorod, and Carroll recorded his impressions of Russia at this time in kind of a travelogue form. He really focused on standard tourist attractions and cultural curiosities as opposed to engaging in a more, I guess, in-depth analysis of what he was seeing. So, for instance, he was fascinated by the architecture of Russian Orthodox churches. He enjoyed theater. He was interested in cultural differences between his home in Britain and places in Russia. So, for instance, he wrote, quote, "It was full of a wonder and novelty," end quote, quote, "the enormous width of the streets, the huge illuminated signboards over the shops and the gigantic churches, with their domes painted blue and covered with gold stars, and the bewildering jabber of the natives all contributed to the wonder," end quote. Carroll shared this in his travel journal. As Professor Morton and Cohen wrote, Carroll also documented, quote, reports of encounters with simple people, a waiter, a droshky driver, a shopkeeper, end quote. And droshky is a carriage that would have been used at the time. Quote, "His descriptions of Moscow is equally picturesque, with the ubiquitous droshky drivers adding the touch of unreality." Quote, "We gave 5 or 6 hours to a stroll through this wonderful city, a city of white and green roofs," end quote. Authors Richard Michael and Richard Kelly describe, end quote, Carroll's impressions of visiting Moscow. Overall, Lewis Carroll considered Moscow a fascinating place, kind of a place where urban life was reflected through a magic mirror. So it's for this reason that some scholars believe that the idea for Through the Looking Glass may have been born in Moscow. But whatever the case may be, Lewis Carroll's own Alice in Wonderland into the 21st century has been translated multiple times, and there are approximately 36 variants, ranging from the 1879 Sonia in the Kingdom of Wonder by an unknown translator to the 1923 version called Anya in Wonderland by Vladimir Nabokov, and of course translations that came later were closer to the original because they did not change the name to Sonia and Anya. Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, Vasily Drazdov, met Lewis Carroll and H.P. Little on August 12th in the Troitsky Monastery. Now, the cleric was actually the most influential man in the Russian Orthodox Church for several decades at the time, and he happened to pass away later that same year. So the pair kind of lucked out by meeting him. And in 1994, Philaret was actually canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church, so today he's considered a saint. And that day, Lewis Carroll wrote in his journal that it was, quote, the most interesting day. Later, the pair headed to Nizhny Novgorod and they attended the annual fair. At the time, this was the biggest fair of its kind in Russia. Carroll described, quote, constantly meeting strange beings with unwholesome complexions and incredible costumes, end quote. So you can see that he was not immune to othering foreigners in their own home. But of course, this was a fair, so people probably would have been dressed up for such an important event. So later, the author's impressions of his trip overall were published as the Russian Journal, or alternatively the Russian Diary, in 1935, and there have been some later editions since that point. So that's all I have for you. I'm curious to learn what you guys think. Did Carroll really conceive of Through the Looking Glass in Russia, in Moscow, because it seems so different to him? Do you think he could have provided a little bit more in-depth analysis of what he was encountering as opposed to kind of a more generic travelogue, or does it really matter? So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I will see you soon.